It is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Barry Salter, Manager of Translation Research at SRA, a very familiar face for the Australian sugarcane industry. Barry is always generous with his time and expertise when it comes to presenting and engaging with the industry. Barry brings extensive expertise in crop production research and, importantly, in translating research outcome into meaningful impact for the industry. He has been a major contributor to the development of the 6 Easy Steps nutrient management program, as well as to the development and validation of modern sugarcane farming systems that have evidently improved soil health and economic performance for growers. Knowing Barry, I'm going to stop here because he probably doesn't enjoy me talking about him too much. So without further delay, Barry, the virtual floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Nathalie, for that generous introduction. Thank you, everyone, for coming along to this webinar and taking some time out your day, and hopefully it'll be valuable to you. You can see I'm talking about agronomic constraints that affect sugarcane productivity, but I guess one thing I should say is that I couldn't possibly cover all of them in a talk, and so I've concentrated on a few, and you'll see that through the presentation. So I think the best thing to do is probably just to get stuck right into it. Look, so you can see this figure that I've got here. This is yield data for one of our regions, the central region around Mackay, and this is yield over time. And I think you can all clearly see that there was a period of time when yields were increasing, in the early days of cane production in the region. But certainly since about the 1980s, roughly, that increase in yield has plateaued off, and it's fairly flat. There were some really good years with Q1 to 4, and combined with some really good growing years as well. So you can see that in the mid-90s. But essentially, yields for that long period of time have remained pretty stagnant. And the reality is that the yield we produced in 1986 has only actually been beaten once in the last 20 years, and that was in 2022. So I see this as being one of the major challenges that the industry is facing. How do we actually get this curve to start trending back up again? One of the other things I like to put into presentations is just this relationship that we've got here, and that's productivity equals genotype by environment by management. And I guess the main thing to take out of this is that we need all 3 of those things to be sort of working in our favour to get good productivity. So we need good varieties, we need good environmental conditions, even though we can't sort of control many of those things like sunlight and rain and so on. But we certainly need good management. And you can see all the things I've listed there under management. There's obviously a lot more than that. And variety management is a key factor in that as well. So things like getting your clean seed, rotating varieties to control pachymetria, and also just making sure that you've got like the best variety in the right paddock on farm. So yeah, the main point is we need all of those things working together: good varieties, good management. And then hopefully we get some good environmental conditions as well. So the first constraint I'm really going to touch on is compaction. And look, these aren't really in any specific order, but I do think compaction is one of the major problems we've got. You can see there in some of those images, these are probably pretty extreme cases of compaction caused by harvesting. But certainly, compaction's happening even when you don't see these, really big ruts and things that are produced when the cane's harvested when it's really wet. Now, the interesting thing, I guess, is that you can see that same figure again with the yields over time, and that brown arrow is the period of time where the industry is basically being 100% mechanised. And so I guess the question is whether or not the machinery that's now going into our paddocks and how heavy it is partly responsible for why we haven't been able to increase yields. is the compaction caused by the mechanisation of the industry. One of the reasons why we flattened off. And now it's pretty impossible to actually say that that's the cause, but I guess the issue is that there's probably a correlation there. And so you need to think about whether or not that's part of the problem. So in sort of preparation for doing this, this webinar, I managed to find some new work that's actually come out of Brazil. And so this is work done by Delman et al. Came out in 2024. And what they were trying to do was assess the impact of field traffic on soil compaction and yield. And like I said, it is work that was done in Brazil. And so what they did was they had a 1.5 metre single row harvesting system. It happened to be a clay soil. They went into that trial and they hand harvested the whole thing. And then they imposed the different traffic treatments. So you can see one of them was a track harvester on its own. Another one was a tractor with a 3-axis trailer, which is a haul out essentially. And then they also had a treatment where they had both of those in the plots as well, so the harvester and the haul out. And I should say that the effects that I'll talk about is not related to harvester damage or harvest losses, because like I said, they actually harvested the cane by hand before they put the traffic into the system. So they literally just ran these machines down the rows without them actually harvesting. And so if you look at the numbers that you've got there, in the hand harvested section, there was 125 tonnes of cane per hectare, but we just put the harvester in, it was down to 92. So there was a 26% yield loss by just trafficking that block with a harvester. When they put a haul out into the system, there was a 32% yield loss associated with the haul out. And interestingly, when they put the harvester and the haul out into the system, there was a 31% yield loss. So essentially what that seems to be indicating is that traffic with one of those machines, a harvester or a haul out, can cause roughly a 30% yield reduction. Didn't matter which one it was. But they didn't, it wasn't additive. So, 30% plus 30% didn't add up to 60%. It was pretty much 30%, with both of them. So, pretty much one pass of any of those units caused a 30% yield loss. So it's certainly an indicator that compaction is a major problem. And I guess over the years, we've heard similar anecdotes from overseas where you might have an estate overseas that's, converting from hand harvesting to mechanical harvesting. And you hear the anecdote that the yields drop significantly in the mechanical harvested section. And some of those estates sort of start wondering whether or not this was a change that they should actually be making. Oh, I know we're not changing slides anymore, so I'll try and do that. Right. So then, in terms of the Australian setting, I suppose we can look at what the effect of compaction that we've seen here. And so back in the day when the Sugar Yield Decline joint venture was still operating, we had a couple of trials, one in Ingham and one in Mackay, where we basically got to the end of the crop cycle and then we planted cane back, started a new crop cycle, but we either did that with no tillage or with full tillage. And you can see in these images here, on the right-hand side, we've got beds where we've conducted no tillage at all. We've gone back in and planted cane into those old beds. And then you've got beds here where we've fully worked the ground, reformed beds and planted cane back into that system there. And so essentially what we'd established was cane growing in a compacted old bed versus cane growing in an uncompacted new bed. And then we looked at some of the indicators of compaction in those systems. And so this is from the Ingham trial. And just to explain these figures, this is soil depth down the side here. So it goes from the soil surface up here down to about 35 centimetres. on the left-hand side. And then essentially this is the cross-section of the bed. So you can see the middle of one bed going down into the interrow, a whole sugarcane bed, the other interrow, and then back up the side of the other bed. And so where we performed that tillage, you can see that within the bed, the soil wasn't really compacted at all. So you can see that blue colour, compaction in this case, is where the colours are starting to go from green through to yellow to red and so on. And so that's around 2,000 kilopascals, and that's roughly the sort of pressure where roots won't be able to push through that soil or explore that soil. So you can see in the tilled situation, the bed is fine, nice and uncompacted. You can see down at about 25 centimetres, this is probably where the clay layer comes in. So the soil's getting a lot more hard there. And you can see some evidence of wheel traffic probably from planting with tractors and so on. So in that interrow, you can see slightly higher compaction as you would expect. The real difference is obviously where we had that zero till, where we've had a whole crop cycle and then planting back into that system with no tillage. You can see all the really dark sort of reds, nearly, well, I guess brown and purple type colours. And that is not only in the interrow, but that's all the way into the bed and the shoulders of that bed. And you can see it on both sides. And basically, there's just this narrow section down the middle of that bed that was uncompacted. And then pretty much the rest of it was severely compacted. Now, interestingly enough, this data is actually from a 1.8 metre row spacing, but not with guidance. So even on that wider row spacing, we were getting a hell of a lot of compaction in the system. And then just to show you that that wasn't unique to the one trial, this is the Mackay trial, the exact same data that I'm showing. In the Mackay trial, the till section, again, the bed was uncompacted, but there was probably a little bit more compaction on the interrow and when the data was collected. But again, you can see in the zero till system, where we haven't done anything in terms of relieving compaction, you can see compaction all the way into the sides of those beds again. And again, it's just this little strip down the middle that was not compacted. What sort of problems does that cause, or what sort of things that happen? You can see in this data the tilled section, so that T for tilled. You've got a bulk density that is now lower than in the no-till section. So the bulk density has improved. It's a lower number, and essentially because there's more pore spaces, it's less dense. You can also see in things like gravimetric water content and volumetric water content that you've got higher moisture holding capacity, and in this case, when it was measured, higher moisture within those soils on the tilled beds because of that, alleviation of that compaction problem. So once you've got rid of the compaction, lower bulk density, ability to hold more water. What did this all mean in terms of cane yields at this site? Or at these sites? So at Ingham, in the plant cane, the tillage section was 141 tonnes to the hectare compared to 90 in the compacted beds, which was a 57% difference in terms of yield in the plant cane crop. Interestingly enough, once we got into the first ratoon and second ratoon, that big difference basically disappeared. It was definitely no longer statistically significant. And so, there was a big difference in plant cane, but the difference in the first ratoons and the second ratoon had basically disappeared. And, our thoughts were that basically that first harvest had then caused compaction again in the tilled section. And so there was now very little difference in terms of compaction between the two systems. And so our yields were no different in those returns. And interestingly enough, in Mackay, we basically got the exact same result. The difference wasn't quite as big, 131 tonnes versus 113 in a plant cane, which was only a 16% difference or 16% loss because of compaction. But the same thing happened in the returns. And so again, we thought, well, the compaction has been reintroduced by the harvesting of that plant crop. So you can see I'm trying to demonstrate here that compaction is having a significant impact in Australia, as well as what was reported from Brazil. And those trials I just showed you were, from a while back. So here's some more recent data that we've collected as well. This is a very similar trial that was conducted in Mackay a few years ago. In this case, when we got to the end of the crop cycle, the tillage we used was a bed renovator followed by a wavy disc, or the other treatment was just the wavy disc on its own. And so we essentially had, where we had the bed renovator, we had alleviated that compaction to a large degree, versus where we just had the wavy disc, which, to be honest, did virtually nothing on a hard compacted bed. And again, you can see those yield differences there. So in the plantain crop, where we had the full tillage with our bed renovator, we've got 120 tonnes per hectare versus 108, 109 with just the wavy disc. So you can see there that yield difference again. The slight difference we did see in this trial was that difference remained through the crop cycle, but started to tail off as well. So you can see there's roughly an 8 or 9 tonne difference in the plant cane. We've got less of a difference, so roughly a 12 tonne difference in plant cane. We've got roughly an 8 tonne difference in the first return, and then it's down to roughly a 4 tonne difference in the second return. So, the introduction of traffic with harvesters and all that and so on seems to be potentially one of the reasons why this difference might be declining. So you can see I've sort of tried to make the argument that compaction's having a major effect. So then the next discussion needs to be, well, what about row spacing or row configuration? And so a large amount of work was done on this, quite a while ago now. But what I did a few years ago was try and get all the data I could find from every single trial that was done on row spacings. And I presented this at the IWSCT workshop in Townsville in 2012. And this is just an example of some of that data. So essentially, this is all the research trials that were conducted in Mackay. You can see that there was, I think, 4 trials here. They had different varieties. Some of the trials had multiple varieties in them. And then I just looked at the differences between 1.5 metre single row spacing versus the 1.8 metre single, or the 1.5 metre single versus the 1.8 metre dual, and some of the differences in yield that were found in those trials. If you look at the overall average, you can see if you compare 1.5 metre single to a 1.8 metre single, overall they produced exactly the same yields. It was literally 105 tonnes to the hectare in both, on both of those systems. Now there was a little bit of going up and down, so you can see in one trial the 1.8 metre single was 15% less than the 1.5, but in other trials it was 7.5% better. And so you had this sort of some were better, some were worse, but overall they produced exactly the same. And a similar result was found for when you compare the 1.5 metre single to the 1.8 metre duals. If you look overall, they produced exactly the same tonnes per hectare, which was amazing, really, which was 107 tonnes to the hectare. And we saw the exact same thing. Some trials, the duals did better. This one 8.4% better, but some trials they did worse. In this case, it was 10.1% worse. And so there was a bit of up and down, but again, overall, they were exactly the same. So that was in Mackay. But like I said, I looked at all the trials from up and down the coast, and these are some frequency distributions, which is essentially looking at those percentage changes from 1.5 metre singles to 1.8 metre singles. How many of those trials did we see a 0 to 5% loss versus a 0 to 5% gain, or 5 to 10, etc., etc. And you can see for the single row systems, you could say that it's a fairly evenly distributed data. That's where the difference is close to 0. But there tended to be a few trials where there were more greater losses on the 1.8 metre single compared to trials where there were gains on the 1.8 metre single. And our thoughts around that was the way that we were planting research trials, which is still the way we plant them now with the whole stick planter and the double disc opener whole stick planter, was that on the 1.8 metre single, the shoot width on our planter was just too narrow. So we were essentially putting billets end to end with pretty low planting rates. And perhaps that was causing some of these differences that we saw with the 1.8 metre single was slightly worse in some situations. When we looked at that exactly, we have 1.5 metre singles versus 1.8 metre duals. It really tended to be a bit the same on each side. And so there were cases where there were trials that were where the duals were better, and also cases where trials where the singles were better. But overall, it seemed to be pretty much centred around zero, with there being no difference. So, of course, we weren't too happy about that 1.8 metre singles, with that result potentially being a few trials where they were worse. But what was then done was there were trials done at commercial scale. And so this was some work done by Brad Hussey in the central region as well. And I've done the exact same thing here. I've compared the 1.5 metre singles to the 1.8 metre singles, or the 1.5 metre singles to the 1.8 metre duals. And in each case, there were well over a dozen trials where this was done. So 19 for the single row crops, and 17 where we were comparing to duals. And again, in this case, in the commercial setting, there was absolutely no difference in yield. So 108 tonnes to the hectare to 109 on average, and 113 for 1.5 metre singles compared to 114 for the 1.8 metre duals. And so the big difference in this setup was that these trials were planted with billet planters. And as you know, billet planters are putting out roughly 10 tonnes to the hectare, maybe slightly less in some cases, maybe slightly more in some cases. So significantly more planting material was going in. And the other thing that growers did in the central region was they whitened the shoot on their planter. And so that was done to try and make sure that the inter-row space didn't actually change. And so even though the row spacing got wider, the shoot was also widened, and so that the inter-row remained the same. And certainly when that was done, there was basically no difference in yield at all. So in terms of discussing all of this, I think we've tried to show that compaction absolutely reduces cane yields. But when it came to wider row configurations, we couldn't really show that there was any difference in cane yield. We certainly couldn't show that there was an increase. And I should point out that most of this was done prior to guidance systems or guidance being available or in place. What we do know is that in every region, there are highly successful growers that have adopted these systems, these wider row controlled traffic systems. And I was only talking to a grower last week in Mackay, where they'd adopted this system, and they pointed out some of the efficiency gains and economic gains that they believe come with this system. They're talking about 16% less turns, 16% less rows to travel in a hectare, and so on, and also being able to get onto some paddocks when it's a bit wetter than other situations. So there's certainly some highly successful growers that have adopted these systems, and in that image there, you can see an example of controlled traffic probably working really well in wet conditions. But similarly, there's also highly successful growers that have remained on the narrow row spacings as well. And that's the case up and down the coast too. And from our point of view, we often hear that, particularly on sort of 1.8 metre singles, that it's weed control that growers are really concerned about. So I guess from my point of view, I wonder whether or not there's still too much compaction in the system, even in our wide row spacings or our wide row systems. Is it actually unavoidable with a single row harvester or haul-out system? Even where we have adopted some of these systems, perhaps there's still significant compaction in the system that's causing us problems. And so if it is causing us problems, what can we actually do about this? And there was some more work that came out of Brazil, this case, NITO, again, recently in 2025. And I do find it interesting that we seem to be getting these papers out of Brazil, because I am starting to think that perhaps they're just running into the exact same problems that we've got with their adoption of mechanisation. But the suggestion from this author was that in order to really make controlled traffic work, you need standardisation of the entire fleet. So that's harvesters, the entire fleet track widths. And so that's harvesters, haul-outs, tractors, everything essentially, which no doubt has a financial challenge. They also said that you need high precision guidance on the entire fleet, that you needed highly qualified operators with the awareness of the importance of controlled traffic. And they cited that there'd be a staff turnover risk, if those highly qualified operators left and you then had to get less qualified operators, that would then be a problem. But they essentially suggested that the success of controlled traffic relied on a strict obedience of sticking to those traffic lanes. And so you can see that, I think those are reasonable suggestions, but they're not necessarily easy to adopt, I suppose, particularly the potential financial challenge of having the entire fleet on the same system. So what do I think we can do? Well, I think perhaps what we should be doing in terms of SRA is working with those early adopters, the ones that adopted controlled traffic and guidance, and trying to understand the extent to which they've been able to control compaction. That might mean going in and taking some of those similar measurements, like I showed with those different other images of compaction across the bed. And once you've identified how well it's been controlled, try and identify whether or not they have experienced a yield advantage from it. Now, I've got some ideas as to how to do that, but I'm not sure those growers are going to want me to do what I really want to do in their paddock, but we'll see whether or not we can. But ideally, if we can show that those growers have actually experienced a yield advantage and they've been able to control compaction enough in that system with guidance and controlled traffic, then perhaps that's a way of trying to reinvigorate adoption to try and overcome this issue. The alternative to that, I guess, is a complete rethink of how we harvest sugarcane, or the sugarcane harvesting system, which is sort of blue sky. And to be honest, right now, that kind of feels sort of far-fetched and unaffordable. I do like the idea of the the two-row harvester. I think it would be even better, a better system if the haul-outs were on 2 rows as well. And certainly, if we can find some of those systems to work on, it would be really good to have a look at them as well. But yeah, certainly beyond harvesting 2 rows at a time, if we go try to harvest any more rows than that, it just seems like it might be too sort of far-fetched, to be honest. Right. That was compaction. The next one I'm going to talk about is waterlogging. And look, if you see those numbers next to the title, those are actually project codes. And so if you had the time to go into SRA's e-library, you might be able to search for those project codes to find some more information on some of the projects I'll talk about. But look, I think waterlogging is another one of our significant issues. We all know that you get waterlogging when you get excessive rainfall on a poorly drained soil. Essentially, what waterlogging does is it really significantly reduces the amount of oxygen in the soil, so the soils become anaerobic, which affects the functioning of the root system. And some of the things you see are the root system starting to come to the soil surface. So you can see in this image at the top here all the new fine roots that are being produced right on the surface in this waterlogged plot. And again, that's associated with the root system needing oxygen, and the water on the soil surface is more oxygenated than the water in the subsurface. You can also see in these pots that we've got down in these other images how much of an impact it actually has on the root system. So there's this pot on the right-hand side, which was waterlogged. You can see that most of the root systems ended up in the top few centimetres of that pot, compared to a fully drained pot, which, as you know, you've got the roots distributed all the way through that pot. So has a big impact on the root system. But there are some other things that happen. You start to see things like ethylene being produced, you get manganese and ions being produced in the soil, you get hydrogen sulfide, you get methane. So there's a whole range of chemical things or chemical changes that happen in those waterlogged soils as well. And some of those sort of have almost a toxicity type effect on the root system too. And in terms of the physiology, apart from changing in the root system, you can also get tissues called parenchyma being produced, which essentially the plant's trying to create air channels between the shoots and the roots to try and get some oxygen to the root system. So what effect is waterlogging having on productivity? There's been a few reviews done in terms of the effect of rainfall on productivity. There's one in the Herbert, there's one I did in Central, there's also one in Tully, which I haven't listed there. But a number of reviews that link excessive rainfall to poor productivity in a number of our regions. Now, it's not just waterlogging that happens at that time. You also get low solar radiation, obviously, when it's raining, the clouds blocking off the sun. And you also get the issues with nutrient losses as well. But certainly the actual physiological effect of waterlogging is part of it. And look, there's this old rule of thumb that you lost 0.5 tonnes per hectare for every day that the water table was within the top 50 centimetres of the soil surface, which came from Rudd and Charter in 1977. So again, if I look back at this, that figure that I've shown a few times now, and I've now highlighted a few years where this has been part of the problem. So 1991, which is certainly before my time in the industry, but I can see it in the data, and the growers I talk to talk about it as well. That was a significant rainfall event associated with a tropical low that went down essentially the whole east coast. And you can see that dip in yield in multiple milling regions from that event. So it had a huge effect on yield. The 2010-2011 La Nina event had a huge effect on yield in a number of regions. In the review that I did, I can show that the waterlogging or excessive rainfall was having an effect on yield in this period here, roughly from 2008 through to about 2012, 2013 as well. But you see here, I've got one in yellow, and you're probably saying, well, that wasn't waterlogging, that was orange rust, and it certainly was orange rust. But 1999 and 2000, those seasons were also very, very wet. And so part of the yield loss in that rust year was significantly affected by rust, but also there was a partial effect from too much rainfall and waterlogging as well. And interestingly, before rust even turned up, you can see a significant decline from 1998 to 1999. Where the 1999 cane season, again, was a very wet season. And there's this big decline in cane yield, even prior to rust turning up. Now, some of that's associated with a wet harvest of that 1998 crop, which was a big crop. But yeah, like I said, that 1999 season was very, very wet as well. So you can see I'm sort of making the case here that there's, waterlogging, excessive rainfall is having a big effect on some of our yields. We did do some work where we, or certainly, new work in comparison to that paper from 1997. And so this is some data from a trial where we had, eight varieties in a trial in England where we imposed waterlogging. And you can see there we've got a control, which is not waterlogged, versus an early waterlogging treatment where we waterlogged plots in the trial for basically a month in January. And then the late treatment is where we waterlogged plots in that trial roughly from the end of February through March. And you can see the significant effect that had on these varieties. Q200 lost more than 40 tonnes to the hectare when we waterlogged it for a month in January when the crop was still pretty small. And when we waterlogged it late, well, the crop is a little bit larger, but you can still see we lost 20 to 30 tonnes from the later waterlogging event. So certainly if it gets waterlogged when the crop is small, it's a much bigger effect than when it gets waterlogged when the crop is larger. Looked like there were some variety differences. So Q200 was pretty affected pretty badly. This other variety, MQ239, seemed to do slightly better in this particular trial. So what we tried to do was have a look at variety tolerance. But one of the things we encountered, and this is from some of the information in QCane Select back in the BSES days, was the varieties had different waterlogging ratings in the different regions. So you could see, for example, that Q183 was considered a poor waterlogging tolerance variety in the northern coastal area, but it was apparently good in the Herbert. And it was apparently good in the Burdekin, but it was poor again when it got in the central region. And that was the case for a number of varieties where the rating was actually different in different regions. And the reason behind that is probably because this information is coming from anecdotes from the region as opposed to coming from some actual data or a trial that tried to identify the waterlogging tolerance of the variety. And so what we tried to do in this project was actually develop a method in pots to waterlog cane and use that to tell the differences in waterlogging tolerance of the varieties, and obviously with the hope of providing that information to the growers, or better information to the growers than perhaps what the anecdotes were. And so we were quite able to cause waterlogging in pots and cause the cane to be severely stressed by waterlogging in pots. But at the same time, we had that field trial that I showed some data from earlier. And you can see in this image here, there's one of the plots where we're trying to drain some water out of one of those waterlogging treatments at the time. And so what we ended up doing was, well, comparing the information we've got out from our pot trial to the field trial, and we encountered a bit of a problem. And so you can hopefully see in this figure that we looked at the relative performance of the varieties in the pot trial. And so in this case, you've got something like Q208 was, where we waterlogged it, it was 50% worse than the control where it was not waterlogged. And then we compared that essentially to what happened in the field trial. And so you can see there's a few varieties here that swap over in terms of the rating or the ranking from 1 to 8. So one of those was MQ239. In the pot trials, it performed really poorly with waterlogging, but in the field trial, like I said, it actually did relatively well. And similarly, Q200, which I said did poorly in the field trial, and you can see that here, but it did relatively well in the pot trial. And obviously that causes a major problem, because if the information you're getting from the pot trial is different to what you get in the field, then that information is not really going to be of any use to growers. So unfortunately, that attempt to try and gain that information didn't work. So really that leaves us with trying to manage the waterlogging problem until we can perhaps look at waterlogging tolerance of varieties again at some stage. And so the things that we suggest for managing waterlogging were things like laser leveling your blocks, making sure your drainage systems are as good as possible, planting and retuning early in the season, so that those crops have as much time as possible before the wet season to try and get them as big as possible before the wet season, essentially. Growing those crops on raised beds is one of the things that's always mentioned. You can see here in this image from that same trial where we've got a cane that's essentially established in the wall of that bunding that we use to waterlog the plots. You've got a cane that's nearly up on that wall compared to cane that's actually in the area that was waterlogged. There was a large visual difference there in terms of how well it performed when it was up on that bed to some extent. Now there is a bit of a visual difference here because the starting height's actually a little bit different But I think you can see there that it certainly looked like the cane that was up higher in terms of being on the bed performed significantly better. The other thing to do on raised beds is to put your fertiliser into that mound and try and keep that above the level of the water, above water level. And also, if you have irrigation, to use that early to try and get that crop as big as possible again before the wet season starts. And so those are the things, those are sort of the tools that we have to try and deal with this issue at the moment. One other thing I suppose to mention there is enhanced efficiency fertilisers. We did a large amount of work on these a few years ago in the EF60 project. Nitrification inhibitors block nitrogen in the ammonium form, which is far less likely to be lost than if it's in the nitrate form. And so if you can block it in the ammonium form for a period of, a number of weeks, 10 weeks or so on, you've got the ability to actually take up nitrogen in the ammonium form and hopefully try and reduce the losses that might occur if it got converted all the way through to nitrate without any issues. So yeah, the main result out of that project was that we could show you could almost reduce your N rates by 20% with an enhanced efficiency fertiliser and not have any impact on yield. But I would say that's probably something you should test out on a farm first before adopting that on every single block. Give it a go, make sure you're comfortable with it before you, like I said, do it on the whole farm. I mentioned that was in the EF60 project, and that was managed by Julian Connell, and he also has a LACT paper on that work as well. Right, the next one was marginal soils. Significant amount of cane production is now happening on marginal soils. So these are soils with low organic carbon, there's solidity, salinity, acidity, compaction, which I've already mentioned. They've got low moisture holding or water holding capacity. Most often they're poorly drained as well. And these soils are quite, there's quite a lot of these soils in our sugarcane regions. And this picture here is of a soil called Wallingford in the Mackay region. It has sodicity problems, probably, in the subsoil starting around 30 odd centimetres. And poor drainage as well, starting at that same sort of depth. But below that, at 50 centimetres, you start getting sort of gravel and rocks as well. And so it would certainly be considered a marginal soil. And to be honest, this where we took this particular picture is no longer growing cane. It's used for as a cattle block. So you can see the potential issue with marginal soils if we can't do something about them. There's the possibility that they're actually taken out of production. So there was some work done in the grains industry where they were using chicken manures and compost, and they were essentially applying that into the subsoils of some of these marginal soils. And so, yeah, the word we're using is they were sort of slotting these products into the subsurface, roughly 20 to 40 centimetres of depth, and they were just trying to get that organic matter into that sort of sodic layer. And they showed significant yield responses to doing that in the grains industry, and a lot of that was attributed to increasing soil moisture and also increasing the volume of soil that the roots could extract moisture from and so on. And so we had an attempt at doing this in sugarcane a few years back, and for us, obviously, the sort of the most likely product we thought that would be used would be the mill byproducts that we've got access to. So we set up a trial where we had a number of treatments. There was control where we did nothing. We had deep ripping where we applied no product. We put gypsum at depth. We put fertiliser at depth. We had mill mud ash on the surface at 60 tonnes to the hectare. And then we had some of these slogging treatments where we had mud ash at roughly 20 tonnes to the hectare at 20 to 30 centimetre depth. And we had mud ash with some compost, and we had compost on some. And so you can see some of these treatments in these pictures, the banded mill mud on the surface, the implement that we made to implement these treatments. And again, that image of the soil profile where you can see that organic matter sitting there, roughly 30 centimetres. Now, there was a few of these trials, but I'll just report on the one. But we've got similar results in all of them. We couldn't actually find many yield differences at all, to be honest. And so if we looked at each individual crops that plant came, we found no statistically significant difference between our treatments. And it was exactly the same for the first return and for the second return. We couldn't find any statistically significant differences. However, when we started, or when I compared treatments or groups of treatments, we could sort of start to see a little bit of a trend. And so this was done on cumulative cane yield. So I added the plant first and second return yields together. I should say there was a very poor year in the first return because of Cyclone Debbie. So that's why some of these yields are a bit lower than what we would hope for. But when I compared the treatments where we applied no product, so the control and the ripping treatment, to the treatments where we put some organic matter into the system, so that was these four, you can see that we had significantly higher yield where we put some organic matter into the system. So 202 tonnes or 203 tonnes versus 182 tonnes over the crop cycle. So there definitely seemed to be a benefit from that organic matter. Similarly, if we just compared the ones where we put the organic matter in the subsurface, that was significantly better at the 10% level than if we just ripped with the implement and applied no product. So again, the implication there was putting organic matter into these soils made a benefit. However, when we compared the banded mud on the soil surface versus the ones where we put mud ash, slotting mud ash in the subsurface, it was actually the banded mud on the soil surface that was slightly better in this case. And so I guess my conclusion from all of this was that, yes, adding organic matter into this system certainly provided a benefit, but slotting it into the subsurface probably didn't really show any particular benefit, just having some organic matter in the system. And it actually looked like the higher the rate of that organic matter, because our band mud treatment had the highest rate of product, was a good thing to be doing. And if you look at some of the other work that's happened with mill byproducts, and in particular the work by Atkinson and Larson in 2019, or published in 2019, they did a number of trials in a few of the Wilmar regions, and again they found significant yield increases from mill byproducts. So in this particular trial, the control was 108 tonnes per hectare, and where they applied mill byproducts, they were getting 124, 131 tonnes. Similar outcome for some of these other trials, 202 tonnes, obviously a Burdekin trial. In the control, the 229, 228, where they applied product. They applied the products in a different way, and I'll talk about that on the next slide, but also they were using higher rates than what we did when we were slotting organic matter into the subsurface. But certainly the use of mill byproducts and organic matter in the mill byproducts is increasing yields, or has increased yields. And so I guess just to summarise all of that, certainly mill byproducts on marginal soil seems to be beneficial. The optimum rates is probably 50 to 100 tonnes to the hectare, based on that work from Atkinson and Larson. There was no real evidence that slotting was needed. And what Atkinson and Larson tended to do was open a furrow, apply the product, you put a ripper through that line, and then close the furrow. And one of the advantages of doing it like that was that there was a relatively low capital investment, because just about every grower has an implement already that will open a furrow. Many of the mill byproduct trucks in every region are able to then apply product into that open furrow. And then obviously the growers also have a ripper that they're able to use that they've already got, and they're able to close that furrow with implements that they've already got. So it's a pretty low capital investment in terms of getting it done. Obviously there's multiple passes. And so, right now with diesel prices, that might not be the very attractive thing to be doing right now. the yield advantage would certainly help offset that. The only other point I'd add to this is that you do need to manage the nutrients after the application of these products, and we have guidance in the 6 easy steps as to how to do that. And essentially what you're trying to do there is manage any CCS impact that there may be. So if I keep going now, I'll talk about some nutrient and chemical constraints, and they're clearly going to go over time, so hopefully people can hang around. But I guess we were worried that we'd spent a hell of a lot of time working on nitrogen in the last 20 years and not a lot of time looking at any of the other nutrients. And you can see what I've written here. I looked at the last 23 years of the ASSCT conference, and there were 105 papers written that had nitrogen in the title, but only 7 papers had phosphorus in the title, only 12 papers had potassium in the title, and so on and so forth. There were only 10 papers that talked about micronutrients, acidity and sodicity in total. So you can see the clear dominance of, or clear focus on nitrogen that's reflected there. And clearly that's because of the focus on reef water quality. So we thought we were sort of the industry was kind of blind to the development of other emerging nutrient issues. And so we did a soil and leaf survey to try and see what potential problems might be emerging. One of the things was soil carbon, or in this case, organic carbon, the Walkley Black method. You can see the average in the different regions was a bit variable. Which is fine, that's just normal. But there were a high percentage of samples where organic carbon was less than 0.8%. So you can see in the central region, 55% of the samples were less than 0.8%. And I guess the worrying thing was when we can look back at a previous survey where the data was mainly collected in the 1990s. Previously in the central region, there were only 26% of the samples where organic carbon was less than 0.8. And that occurred in a number of the regions, like the southern region, the Herb region, not so much in Tully, but yet again in the far north. And so I guess the implication is perhaps soil organic carbon is actually still declining in our farming system. I would point out that the Burdekin was completely different to that. I don't know why, and I don't really have an explanation for it. It may be associated with sample sizes, but I don't know, but it's certainly acknowledged that the Burdekin result was unusual. And so, look, if organic carbon's increasing, how's that happening when we've been trash blanketing for so long? And so this takes us to the long-term trash trial that's been conducted on the Mackay station for nearly 30 odd years, where we've been burning trash for 30 years, or we've had a trash blanket for 30 years. And the unusual thing that we're actually seeing in that trial is that carbon seems to be higher, or at least it's no different, but potentially higher in the burnt system. And so this is the total carbon in the top 25 centimetres of soil. So there's 43, in this case, 43 tonnes of carbon in the burnt system in the top 25 centimetres on a hectare basis, compared to 38 in the trash blanket system, which is the opposite of what we would have expected. But we see that in some of the other measures of soil carbon, in this case, total organic carbon using the Haynes method, and down here, organic carbon using the Walkley Black method, exactly the same situation. The only place where we saw a slight increase or improvement with the trash blanket was labile carbon, which is the really active form of carbon, and that was only significantly higher in the trash blanket system in the top 2 centimetres of soil. So yeah, we don't seem to have changed soil carbon because of trash blanketing, which is not what we were hoping for, I suppose. What we do see is that trash blanketing increases cane yields at this site, and particularly in the ratoons. So this is the data from the last 3 crop cycles. You can see the trash blanket system averaging 91 odd tonnes per hectare in ratoons compared to 84 in the burnt system. And we think and we're pretty sure that's because of the moisture retention at the capacity of trash as a mulch on the soil surface. There was no difference in plant cane crops. And I guess it's not surprising given that there isn't actually a trash blanket in plant cane crops, and so you don't get that moisture retention property. And so that's led us to a new project where we're going to be, I guess, tinkering around with the management of trash. And so we're going to try a few new things, subtle changes, I suppose, not major changes. We're going to be adding nutrients to trash. One of the reasons why we think that the carbon hasn't gone up is because in order to break the trash blanket down, microbes need to find nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur, which the trash doesn't have a lot of in it. And so potentially they might actually be finding nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur in the organic matter in the soil, or mining that organic matter in the soil in order to break the trash blanket down. And so you get sort of a mining of one component, whereas and an input from the other, and essentially things just end up staying the same. So we'll be trying that. We'll also be looking at removing trash. So, you know, we hear of products being made from biomass, and certainly trash gets mentioned in terms of people harvesting biomass. So we'll have some treatments where we will remove trash, and we're also going to have some light tillage treatments as well. So those trials are pretty new. They started off, we planted a couple of them last year, and we'll obviously monitor those through the life of the project. And just quickly, some new data from that trial. One of the criticisms we had previously was that we'd only really looked in the top 25 centimetres of soil, and that maybe carbon was accumulating in the trash blanket system lower down in the soil profile, so at deeper depths. And so since then we've resampled that trial and sampled all the way down to a metre, and certainly there's no sign of carbon accumulating at depth in that trash blanket system. And again, there in this data set, you can see the burnt system having slightly higher total carbon percentage in this case than the trash blanket system, which still sort of surprises me, even though I've seen it multiple times now. So in terms of some beneficial practices that we can talk about for trying to promote soil carbon, even though I've said that it doesn't seem to be increasing soil carbon, I still think it's a beneficial practice. I am certainly suggesting that we still use trash blanketing, and even just the processing of all that organic matter by the biology in the system, I think is beneficial. We definitely need to try and avoid bare fallows, so having some sort of fallow or cover crop, and I don't really mind too much with all that soybean, cowpea, you know, lab mixed species. I don't really think it makes too much difference, but just having something there in the system. We did some work on mixed species. There's a few pictures there. The only thing I would avoid in mixed species is some grasses like sorghum that might become a weed problem in your cane crops afterwards. But essentially, I think mixed species is not a bad idea. Other organic inputs I think are beneficial. Reducing tillage where possible is beneficial. If you've got a green manure crop, sometimes terminating that crop early just to make sure that there's soil moisture in the system. So if it's looking like a really dry autumn, sometimes spraying those crops out early is a good thing to be doing. And again, in these systems, you know, managing your fertilizer nitrogen, so thinking about the nitrogen that you're getting from some of these other crops and from your mill byproducts. You sort of need to take that into account and reduce your fertilizer and inputs. And just some of the other observations from that leaf and soil survey, there was a high percentage of samples where pH was less than 5.5. I showed this the other day. 31% of the samples in the central region, pH was below 5.5, and similar in some of the other regions. You know, Tully, there's what's that? 44% of the samples were less than 5.5. So, you know, to the extent to which this is affecting productivity, I can't really tell you, but certainly say that it's not ideal from a productivity perspective to have our pHs below 5.5, and in some cases they were less than 5. I've already spoken about organic carbon. Soil potassium, exchangeable potassium levels were very low. We had 90% of samples in a number of the regions where the exchange of potassium was less than 0.2, and high percentages of samples, the 30-40%, where the exchange of potassium was less than 0.1 milliequivalents. So those sort of levels are starting to get really low, and I guess we need to keep an eye on whether or not that's causing us a productivity impact. Certainly for calcium in some regions, we know that will cause a productivity impact. If the value is less than 0.65, you can see in this calcium response curve, you could expect a 10, 15, 20% yield reduction if the value was less than 0.65. And in some regions, Tully, the far north, we have 15%, 11% of samples were in that range. When it's marginal, so between 0.65 and 2%, you might not be seeing a yield impact, or if it is, it might be a small one, 1, 2, 3%. But there's certainly large numbers of crops that have that sort of potential. With 35% of the crops in the central region are in that marginal range. So that calcium issue in some regions is sort of ticking away in the background there, having an impact on yield, and we need to try and reduce that, I suppose. Magnesium wasn't quite as bad as calcium, but certainly in the wet tropics regions, Tully, far north, there were a large number of samples where soil magnesium was lower than the critical value, or in that marginal range as well. And I guess just to round off micronutrients, we saw issues, or potential issues with copper, and potential issues with zinc as well in a number of regions. And again, these issues are probably just potentially having a small impact on yield in a number of in regions and blocks here. One of the main things that came out of that sort of survey was leaf silicon. And so this is a figure with leaf silicon percent and the critical value in red. And you can see in the wet tropics regions, Tully and the far north in particular, we had a very high percentage of samples were below the critical value for silicon, which was obviously concerning. And so a project has commenced last year looking at that particular issue. There were reports in Q240 and 253 of silicon deficiency symptoms. And so that's that sunny side freckling that you can see in the images there. And so, Danielle Skorke and Bernard Schroeder, Ines Valkangros and Erin as well, working on a project to look at that, to see whether or not it's a real issue. I should say that most of those samples, the soil silicon levels were fine. It was the leaf tissue samples that were the problem. And so I guess we're trying to figure out, is this a real issue? What's going on? And I suppose we're sort of wondering whether or not it's a silicon uptake problem, as opposed to a supply problem, I suppose. So again, that's a project that's underway and hoping to resolve what might be going on there. And so just to round out nutrient management, I clearly recommend the 6 easy steps for a balanced nutrient management program. The 6 easy steps is more than just nitrogen and phosphorus. It deals with all macro and micronutrients and ameliorants, etc. So it's really worth looking at the full program to manage all of these issues. pH, I guess, as I showed there, is concerning. It has the potential to impact productivity. Personally, I think we probably need to relook at that 5.5 pH value and see whether or not that's the optimum, or not that it's the optimum, or it's sort of at the lower end of our range. But do we need to look at that and see whether or not, well, maybe we should actually be aiming for 6, given that the work that was done on pH was done, probably 30 plus years ago. So it's just something potentially we might need to look at. A little concerned, obviously, about potassium in the soil. We know that we're exporting more potassium to the mill than what we're applying in terms of fertilizer potassium. So the potential is always there for that to become a problem. And so I guess I'm wondering to what extent that's affecting us now. But we do apply potassium every year, roughly 100 kilos of potassium every year. And so we just need to look at, whether or not there is a risk around potassium or not. Danielle also recommended a number of things that could be done for calcium management, including applying it as early as possible prior to the wet season to allow time for things, the reactions to happen, increasing soil testing frequency, obviously following the guidelines that you get from those soil tests, possibly applying calcium more often at lower rates, so applying it to more crops within the crop cycle, not just at the start. And then certainly if you're going beyond the fourth return, to think about whether or not you need to reapply calcium. In some cases, in those wet tropic regions, there's some old returns that are probably suffering from calcium deficiencies. And in terms of magnesium, the recommendation is similar for what Danielle proposed for calcium. So I've definitely gone over time, but just to summarise all of that, I clearly think that compaction is a significant problem. Fully support the yield decline joint venture principles, and we should always keep those in mind, breaking the monoculture, control traffic, reducing tillage and trash blanketing. I think we need to try and reduce the impact of waterlogging, obviously, particularly in the wet regions. And I mentioned things like drainage systems, laser leveling, etc. Those mill byproducts, that organic input and other organic inputs into marginal soils are definitely beneficial. And like I said about the 6 Easy Steps program, I certainly would recommend that, and also the guidance in the 6 Easy Steps toolbox that's on the SRA website. So this takes me back to this figure again that I started with. Like I said, I think it's a significant industry challenge that we've got to try and overcome. I don't think there's any silver bullets out there to actually fix this. I think it's going to take the adoption of validated management practices to improve soil health. I think it's going to take, obviously, good varieties. We're going to need new innovation. And perhaps one of the most important things is we're going to have to be all sort of marching together on this issue. So SRA, growers, millers, pod boards, industry organisations, government, etc. I kind of feel like we all need to be pulling in the same direction, because clearly you can see this is an entrenched issue that's been going for decades, and we kind of all need to rally together, I think, to try and actually overcome this. Some important acknowledgements, the sort of the people I've worked with very closely over the last 20 odd years, Danielle, Julian, Glenn Park, Bernard Schroeder was my first supervisor at BSES, and a really great person to have as a mentor. Neil Harpen, we've worked with a lot of QDPI. The late Alan Garside, again, was a great mentor, and also the other people from that, researchers from that sugar yield decline joint venture team. And you can see I've mentioned a number of projects throughout this presentation. I do need to acknowledge the funding from the Queensland Government and the project funding from the Department of Primary Industries that was provided for various projects throughout this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Barry, for a very great presentation. So there's a lot of thank you, Barry. Great presentation. Lisa said it will be good to look at the new SRA variety and see how they fare with the waterlogging. Is this happening?
Look, it's not happening at the moment, but I think certainly those trials that we did, that are doing that in pots didn't seem to work out for us. But I am aware that there's potential changes in the breeding program, with the hope of taking some of the breeding program trials out to some of probably the soils that do get waterlogged a bit more in some of the regions, and so perhaps some of the information might come from some of those trials that are proposed at the moment. Of course, those changes haven't been implemented yet, so we need to see that happens. But yeah, I think we do need to potentially re-look at waterlogging and see whether or not there is a way for us to actually try and provide better information about our varieties' waterlogging tolerance to growers. But the honest answer to that question is no, it's not happening right now.
All right. Armin, you want to ask your question?
From my own farm and experience with compaction, I'm doing zonal tillage for 10 years now. And over the years, that zonal area that is not tilled in the furrow stabilized very well. It's these days, in the first years of the crop cycle, it's actually the spot where the earthworms survive. And you see all the castings in that area. And when there is traffic in wet years, we just had wet harvests the last couple of years, that I'm the preferred early harvest guy after rain because that area becomes very stable. And that then also means that your compaction, when you have a freshly tilled paddock and you compact the furrow at the first harvest or whatever operation, it seems to develop that bulb where the compaction moves sideways and downwards. In my hard stuff, that doesn't happen that much anymore because that area that is not ripped is more stable. So I found over the years now that I'm on 1.7 meters, so not even the ideal 1.8. So I don't need harvester extensions and stuff because I'm the only one in the group that goes to 1.7, and that's basically the limit without technical changes. And even under those conditions, I can put a spade into the bed right next to that trafficked area, and it's still soft. And I also noticed over the years, initially I could only go half the speed and half the depth with my zonal ripper. And now I go deeper, do it all in one pass and at higher speeds, so it didn't get recompacted to that amount. And then the third and final thing about the liming. You suggested that maybe in those tropical areas, it would be advisable to apply lime somewhere in the crop cycle. I'm a bit concerned that that just washes away because it can only be applied to the surface. When I was farming in Germany, we had the option in my local farming area of getting a mill byproduct from the sugar mill that was basically lime that was so fine it was like flour. And you can put that on the soil, work it in, and you would raise the pH by 2 points. So from 5 or from 4.5 to 6.5 in one hit. 2 years later, it was all gone. The other option for half the cost was to get a limestone from a former tropical reef, from a limestone deposit that was also used to make road base. It was very hard. And for agricultural purpose, we kind of got stuff that looked like crusher dust. It wouldn't do anything in the first year, but over time, over up to 10 years, it would slowly release. And if you apply something that is a bit coarser milled or harder rock, source rock, you might be able to put it in the fallow and have that extended release.
Thanks, Armin. that was quite a question. Look, I don't think I'll be able to cover off on all of that, but if I try some of it, I suppose. Yeah, I guess one of the things in the burdick and with the burning is whether or not maybe, yeah, like you say, you're retaining a charcoal fraction from the burning. So organic carbon's made up of a number of fractions, and sort of a charcoal inert fraction's one of them. So possibly that's being retained in the burn system, and maybe that's what I saw in the trial here in Mackay. Why the burn system was slightly higher was because we've retained that charcoal component. Now, whether or not other organic matter of carbon attaches to that, I'm not really sure, to be honest. I guess it is possible, but yeah, maybe.
Yeah, it was mentioned there. They did trials on some red soil near Byron Bay, Northern Rivers, and there they applied biochar to a former pasture, and then try to raise the organic matter content afterwards with cover cropping and all that. And where they had applied the biochar, that ceiling, that potential for raising the organic carbon was higher.
I think it's possible. Certainly, the sort of the structures within biochar might be able to retain, things like other organic matter and so on. Just in terms of what's happening on your system, like I said, I think ideally what we might need to do is to come to growers like yourself that have adopted these things for a number of years and see whether or not we can actually show the advantages that you're actually experiencing. Perhaps rather than trying to start afresh with someone new, my idea is to actually go to the people that have been doing this for 10, 20 years and see whether or not how much damage I can actually do if I take them backwards. Now, of course, I don't know if you're going to let me do that, which I was hinting at it, but maybe that's how we might actually be able to quantify it. I just point out 1.8 is not necessarily the ideal row spacing. Sugarcane was shown to, produce similar yields across a wide range of row configurations. So I'm certainly not suggesting that there's this 1.8 that's the ideal and nothing else works. There's a number of ways of achieving controlled traffic on 1.9s, 2 meter, 2.4, etc., etc. And the last one with lime, I suppose, just what I was talking about was calcium. And so rather than trying to actually change pH, it was trying to get calcium into the system. And so it wouldn't necessarily have to be lime. It could potentially be gypsum. But yeah, anything that contains calcium would be important, whether or not it's a mill byproduct or some of the things that you mentioned from other places. Yeah.
I mean, price-wise, lime is probably the cheapest. If you see gypsum prices around $200, $220 applied here in the Burdekin, that's frightening.
Yeah. But yeah, I take your point that, obviously something on the soil surface is potentially in those climates could be lost, and so we'd need to think about how we did it. But certainly there's a lot of evidence, and Danielle has a lot of evidence of those older ratoons suffering from calcium deficiency, and so we need to think about what we do for them, because the calcium that is applied at the start appears to be running out.
Sorry, there's a question from Christine. If the trash into the inter-row space, is there any trials to help compaction and waterlogging?
If the trash into the inter-row space, any trials to help compaction and waterlogging? I guess I don't quite understand. Perhaps we're not putting trash into the inter-row space. We're suggesting we might do some tillage of trash to try and incorporate it a little bit, but also retain some on the soil surface to maintain that mulch component of it as well. But look, right now, I think we need to start having a look at compaction again. So right now there isn't much work on compaction. It tended to happen in the yield decline joint venture, which many people know has been finished for quite a while. But yeah, I'm suggesting that I think it's a major constraint, and we need to think about ways of how we actually address it. Even in our new systems that are wider. So there's not really anything happening right now. And like I said, for waterlogging, I guess one of the things happening in the central region for waterlogging is the district manager, Dylan Weddell, is trialling a few varieties. Perhaps I should have said this before, trialling a few varieties on our really heavy clay soils, which tend to get waterlogged, to try and work out which of those perform better. But yeah, I guess clay soils don't always get waterlogged, but yeah, they do. Obviously, in this season, they probably have.
Right. Next question from Nikki Samo. How do you account for small nutrient increases in added mulch treatment, etc.? Could that be main driver for cane yield increases, not small addition of organic carbon? I may have missed if you had nutrient equivalent treatments too.
Yeah, so certainly in those trials where we were placing the mill mud treatment subsurface, we did have nutrient treatments where we placed nutrients into the subsurface as well. and so that was there as almost a control for exactly the thing that you're pointing out, trying to make sure that it was due to the sort of organic component of it as opposed to just the nutrient part of it. And certainly there's been those questions with the work done in the grain system. Since the initial work came out, there has been other work coming out suggesting that some of the, or in some cases a lot of the yield increase they saw was potentially because of the nutrient component of it. But I think perhaps at the moment it's considered to be a bit of both, partly nutrients and partly the organic side of it. So yeah, we did have those treatments to try and control for that problem.
Right. And now I'm just going to answer the last question from Doug, and then we will wrap up. So in a soil that is prone to waterlogging and also has high level of sodium, 10 to 15% of CEC, what is the best practice to manage that high level of sodium?
Look, you probably already know that, like, for sodicity, you really need to try and get those sodium ions off the cation exchange, and so we always would recommend things like gypsum applications, or something with calcium, sometimes lime, depending on the pH, where you're trying to get the calcium to knock the sodium off the cation exchange capacity. The problem, I guess, that you might have on a soil that's prone to waterlogging is it's probably likely to have a high clay content. And so once you've tried to sort of knock it off the cation exchange capacity, ideally what got to try and do is sort of leach that sodium out of the profile. Now, on some of those soils, perhaps the one you're describing, that might be quite difficult, I suppose. So yeah, certainly a challenge, but yeah, the idea is to try and replace sodium on the cation exchange. Organic matter is always helpful on sodic soils as well. But again, the soils that tend to get waterlogged often, like I said, have quite high clay contents. They also tend to be high organic carbon soils as well. So perhaps that the carbon levels are really high, but yeah, certainly calcium in the system, trying to get some organic matter in the system, which helps with soil structure. And yeah, that's probably the best answer I could come up with. Yeah, it depends on, like, you're trying to get drainage into those soils essentially as well. Yeah.
Right. Well, thanks again, Barry, for this presentation today. It was really informative. I think that there is a lot of component in agronomy, and found it hard to believe that you guys do so much work and so many trials, and I know you lots in the mud sometimes and under the rain and everything. So thank you again for taking the time to give us this presentation. I'd like to thank everyone for attending as well. I hope you have enjoyed this webinar today, and that you will join us for the next webinar coming, and it will be advertised on SRA website. So if you want to know about those webinars, you can actually join the list and go to the events page. And also, these webinars are saved, and then we can send you the link. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Barry, and have a great afternoon.
Thanks.